Hello Carrara animators, this is Cyborg Ty with a tutorial showing how I animated the bouncing ball in the movie clip I uploaded for the CarraraTors bouncing ball challenge. Carrara gives us many different ways to animate objects. I assumed this bouncing ball challenge was to get us to focus on our keyframe animation skills, and so that's what I focused on instead of options such as maybe like physics. Now if you look here, you notice in this keyframe animation, if you look at the timeline, I've only got a few keyframes. So what I ended up doing was simply creating a 24 frame animation, rendering out the frames, bringing those frames into Premiere and creating a 10-second animation clip which I uploaded. I know your primary interest in this video is how I got the ball to have the movement or the motion that it has. Now we'll talk about that. Very quickly, as you look at the scene though, it's a very simple scene. I have the plane down here is actually an infinite plane on which I put a grass texture. You'll also find, if you look at the animation, I have trees in the background. Those are actually billboards. I created a pine tree in Carrara, then created a single frame image of it, and then used it as a texture for the simple polygon, and then used a replicator to create many of these, and that's what you see in the background. I also decided that I would have some pine straw, so you'll notice that there's also a strip in here where I've got a texture which actually is a pine straw and some junk, type texture, just to give it a little bit more realism. But simple set, which I also included a stadium seating, which I got out of the football stadium, which is part of the browser content that comes with Carrara. And of course, you look at the ball, it's a simple object and just gave a simple whitish gray texture. As you take a look at the timeline down here, we've got the 3 keyframes. Let's talk about how I did this. So again, I'm selecting the ball object, and what you'll notice as we're moving the timeline indicator, the ball is only moving in the Z or Z axis, so it's going up and down. So that's the only thing I'm changing here. I've given it explicit values in frame 0, 12, and 24, and I'm forcing Carrara to figure out what the position value should be for Z in between these keyframes. Of course, when you create the keyframes, Carrara automatically creates default tweeners, as we call them. And the default would be, after you install Carrara, is usually linear tweeners, but you can actually change those by selecting the tweener and then going here in the upper right to the pull down, and from here you can select your different tweeners. And of course, for this animation I chose the Bezier. You can actually get this done with linear, playing around with that a little bit, but Bezier makes it a little easier. So you select that, and then you actually have to give thought to the motion. So if you give consideration to how a normal ball moves, you find when you drop it, it accelerates, starts getting faster as it comes closer to the ground. When it hits the ground and bounces up, it's quickly moves from the floor, but as it gets to the highest point in its bounce, it starts to slow down, and then as it again starts to drop again, it starts to accelerate. So if that is the motion that you're looking for, you have to give in consideration to what values Carrara should assign to Z in between the keyframes. So obviously we want the values to quickly change, so the height to quickly go up as we move away from the first keyframe, and then starts to slow down, so the height, the change in the height or the change in the Z position starts to slow down. And so in order to accomplish that, you may want to make sure as you adjust the Bezier curve that it actually looks like what I've got here on the right. You notice that it's a curve that's nearly vertical, and then so it very quickly is getting to a point to where right up here, right somewhere in the middle of the complete curve, it just starts to flatten out, and it becomes closer and closer to the value that we have in the next keyframe for the next position. So you want something that looks like this. And then on the way down, oh, and by the way, for those new, you can affect what the curve looks like by playing around with these levers. So I've adjusted them to look like that. And the same thing with on the downside. As the ball is dropping, got to give consideration to a real ball. Obviously, as you drop it, it's slow, but it starts to accelerate as it approaches the floor or the ground before it hits it. And so the curve that makes sense here is we're saying if it's going to be slow as it's pulling away from the highest point in the bounce, then we need a curve that is more horizontal, or we'll say to Carrara we want the value to change from what it is at the highest point, but not to change rapidly, right? So in this case we've got a curve that is more horizontal, and then eventually somewhere in the middle the curve starts to bend and become more and more vertical. And so, as I mentioned before, the more vertical it gets, the rate of change is quicker. So another way to look at this is to take a look at this graph. If you take a look at the leftmost bar indicated by the blue arrow, and let's say that's frame 12, and the red arrow is pointing to frame 18, the rate of change of Z would only go from the bottom of the graph up to where the black arrow is pointing. So not a lot of change. But if we were to look at what happens to the curve between frame 18 and frame 24, notice how it curves and is more vertical. The rate of change is quite a bit, and indicated by the black arrows. Right, so this is the look that you want for your curve. Right, so if you do that, then you've got something that looks like mine. It looks like the bounce of my ball, where as it goes to the top, it kind of hovers a little bit, and then as it goes down, it starts to speed up before it hits the floor. Now I've actually set this to loop, and so that's why it almost appears, as you look at the camera 1 view, you're seeing a representation of what was in the video clip that I uploaded. Well, there's another way to do this, which I actually think is quicker and gives you more control over the motion, and it's using the graph editor. You would actually go ahead and position the ball at the ground for frame 0, and then at frame 12 you would move the ball to the highest point in the bounce, and then at frame 24 you would go ahead and move the ball to the ground again. Then come over here, select the object, and then get into the motion method. Obviously we're affecting the position, which are the transform parameters. So we'll go down in here and then find the position parameters. And if you look at the position parameters, you'll see we've got X, Y, and Z. And we already mentioned how we're only affecting Z. And you can see that by going into the graph editor. In the graph editor, if I were to select X, you'll see that it's showing a red line represented by a red line. Let me expand this a little bit. Represented by a red line. Notice that it's showing from time 0 all the way to time 24. The value does not change. Same thing with the Y, which is represented by green. Notice the value doesn't change. But when we look at Z, notice we've got this curve. Right, so obviously the value does change from time 0 to time 12 seconds, all the way to time 24, and again 24 seconds. And so this is the curve that was created and is a representation of what we set with the tweeners. Now of course we could use the splines that the graph editor allows us to work with. To do that, you can select this and then select this spline tangents button that's here. Alright, when you do that, then you'll see these handles show up, and it also changes your curve. But what's nice is you have a chance then to affect the curve by pulling out these handles. By default, the handles should be linked together. So it says when I pull on one of them and try to move one, it's going to affect the other, which means we're going to affect both sides of the curve. Now there are these two buttons here which actually changes that behavior. If you want to unlink them, if you click that one, now when I move one of these, the other one doesn't get affected. Right? Of course I can click this other button here to link these tangents, and it says now that when I move the handles, both will move together. Alright, and so as we're looking at what this keyframe represents, this is the keyframe for the highest point in the bounce, right? So if I notice here, it starts to drop, and then it starts dropping, becoming more of a vertical deal here, where that says that the rate of change is going to be fast, and obviously in here it's a little slow, and then it speeds up a little bit, but then it gets a little constant because that's kind of a straight line. But I could change that, and it's kind of a straight diagonal line, right? If it's more vertical, then the rate of change would be one that would cause the ball to speed up as it gets to the next keyframe. So I can have that effect by moving the handle. Notice what I'm doing to the curve, right? I'm actually pulling it out, and notice that the rate of change of z is not going to, it's actually not going to be very much change until we start getting to the middle. Then it starts to change and starts to quickly get close to the value of the next keyframe that's set here. And this is what we want, right? So now on the front end, notice that the rate of change is quick, and then as it gets closer to the top, this starts to flatten out, which says it starts to slow down. And then when it gets on the other side, it's still starting to speed up, but it's on the slow side. But then it starts to get faster and faster to when it gets to the next keyframe. And so that's really the behavior. That's really what we want, right? So so if I now click this, you notice it's hovering. It's the same look because I played around with the tweeners before to actually give me the look I wanted. But this is what you maybe would have found was quicker, just going right into the graph editor. If I went in here and selected this, let's say select that tweener and then selected this button here, the linear tangents, what you find is it immediately makes this linear on both sides of the keyframe. So if I now told it to play, you notice it's like an even rate of change, right? The speed of the ball, the motion is actually constant. As it goes up and goes down, the rate of change, the speed is the same. And that's not what we want. So we come back here, we select splines, and of course pull the handles to get what we want. And again, what you like, what you want is a matter of taste for what it is that's going on in your animation. Obviously, if you wanted something more like reality, you'd have to watch a real ball and play with that. And if you want to, you can get your ball to move exactly like a real one. Now, what I also did was added squish and squash, or you see this stretch and squashing that I've got going on. And the way I decided to do that is with morph targets. You could do it different ways. I mean, if you don't know morph targets, maybe as you're playing with this, you're using maybe the scale, and you're scaling it in Z and in X to try to get the shape you want. But I chose to use morph targets. And so you'll find also, if I go back to the sequencer, it's probably quicker for me to go drag down here. You'll find on the object, if I were to expand down here in the sequencer, you'll find that there are 3D shape keyframes. And so if I were to expand this down, you'll see they're associated with the poly mesh. So that says I've got something that actually morphs the shape of the mesh. And I've got what we're referring to here is a morph target, or morph targets. But these morph targets are associated with a morph area that's called ball that I created. Right, so to create these, I mean, I won't get into the morph targets creation here. If you're interested in that, let me know and I'll create a morph target specific tutorial. But when I look at the general parameters for that object, you'll find in this that I actually have an area list where you've got the ball area, and then of course the associated targets. And so when I play the animation, you'll find that the values keep changing because I've decided at certain points in my animation, within the 24 seconds, I would have it stretch as it gets to the height of the, or the top of the bounce, and then when it gets to the ground, I want it to squash. All right, and so I set these different keyframes for that. Now, I think I'm going to use this to also answer a question that was in the forum. Somebody was interested in creating animation clips. All right, so this is something I can do here. Animation quick clips can be very handy, especially if one wanted to really render this out. Instead of having, notice as I mentioned, I rendered out just 24 frames, took those frames into Premiere and then repeated those. What you could do is you can actually render the whole thing in Carrara and not have to go into Premiere and just out of Carrara upload it or do whatever you wanted to if that's what you wanted. But and so the right way to me there are a couple of ways you could have done that. So maybe the quickest way you guys would have thought is just copy these keyframes that are here for the object shaping, to squish and squash, or to stretch and squash as I call them, and up here for the motion, you copy those keyframes and then just keep pasting them. But I'm a big advocate of creating animation clips and using those. And so what I would do is select the object and then come up here to animation and then select create animation group. Now I already did that. You can tell because you notice the object is in an animation group. It actually says so here. When I select animation group, I also will find I've got these tabs out here on the top here. Notice mimic is one of them. Use very much. I use that when I create characters and want to control their phonemes, and I could create actually from scratch. I create the phonemes or gestures in here, and then the NLA is where you want to go when you're creating animation clips. Now you can control what keyframes are actually part of your clip, right? And so you use that. You do that by identifying with this indicator here, right? So you can move that around and make sure that whatever is between your start and stop indicators, those are going to be what's going to get encapsulated within your clip. So what you do is you come here, you select create master clip, and so here, see here you have a chance to identify with how much of the keyframes are actually stored in the clip, right? So notice the time range, so you can say use keyframe range, which in that case would be all the keyframes that exist for that object, and that might not be what you want if you selected this one, if you selected this one. But if you wanted to select what we call the scene range, that's really what we're showing here, right? So that'll only get what's within these little flags, right? So that start scene and the end scene is one way to look at it, right? So and then down below here you have a chance of saying, okay, after it completes this operation, that it should delete objects keyframes, right? Now obviously if you're creating a subset, you're creating an animation clip for only a subset of the keyframes, you don't want to select this because it would wipe out all the keyframes for the object. So obviously in this case I only have the set of keyframes that exist between the start and the stop scene indicators, right? So that's not a big problem for me. Now then down here you also have a chance to identify which parameters. So you don't have to, just because it's got keyframes on certain things, you don't have to create an animation clip that includes all keyframes. But in this case I do, right? So I'm just going to make sure that this is when you look at this, all of these are highlighted or checked, and I'm good to go here, right? So I'm going to select OK. Oh, by the way, before I do that, you want to name the clip, right? So you may want to call this, bounce or bouncing or something, or whatever you want to call it, and then select OK. Alright, so now when you look over in your animation clips path, you'll find that I already had a clip called bouncing, so it created a clip called bouncing 1. So not a big deal, they're both really the same. And so I could drag. Now notice also the keyframes are gone, right? So now, and if I move the time indicator, nothing happens. It went to reset, so it put it to the starting keyframe position. But notice that there's nothing going on here. Alright, so now I could drag either one of these clips that I created into, click and drag, into that track. So you notice when you created the animation group, it actually created a track. So you can put animation clips on that track, and of course you can add additional tracks. So now when I select play, you notice it's playing what we expected. And of course, since I have this looping, it's looping. Now I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to come over here for the general area. Notice the clip is still highlighted, still selected. So I've got over here the NLA master clip instance attributes that I could set. And so down in here I'm going to select loop. Now after you select loop, what's interesting is now you can come down here to the timeline. I'm going to turn this looping option here. Come down to the timeline, and let me see, I'm going to zoom so I can actually do this. I'm going to move this end of scene indicator, and I'm now going to stretch the clip. Now if you notice, as I stretch the clip, and I'm going to stretch it all the way to frame 96. If you notice, if you look closely, you see these little dotted lines in here, right, indicating copies. The best way to look at it is it's repeating all, or repeating up to a certain point of the original clip. So, you know, if I were to go back, what you find is it started over with the animation, but it's stopping here. And obviously, if I keep on going, and notice you see the dotted lines appear once I get to 48. Now you know that it actually repeated all of the animation that existed in the original clip. But anyway, let's move this all the way across. You can prove it out simply by playing the timeline after. So obviously, since I have it as a 24-second animation, you may want something that's longer. So you simply come in here, stretch this out. If you want it 10 seconds, or if you want it 10 seconds, let's just simply then set that end of scene indicator to 240. Stretch the animation clip all the way to that. Yeah, that's good. And then play. And again, you might be seeing something strange because of the screen capture software, so it may not be as fluid. Let me change that. Yeah, that doesn't help. That makes it even worse. Okay. All right, but that's something that so the person that was interested in the animation clips, hopefully that helped. Well, I went over a few things here, identifying with keyframes. I touched a little bit on keyframe interpolation, playing around with setting the motion with tweeners or using the graph editor and splines. Of course, I talked about morph targets very briefly, and then this quick look at the animation clip. I hope you found this to be informative and helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to post. I'm Cyborg Ty. Thanks for watching.